Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Heather Himmelberger.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a beautiful day here in Albuquerque, and I'm hoping that it's not too cold or snowy wherever you are today. I know we've had quite the eventful winter this year. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, and I want to thank the Syracuse EFC for hosting and recording today's webinar, and I want to thank Don Nall of the Southwest EFC for helping facilitate the webinar question and answer session. This webinar is part of the Environmental Finance Center Network's project called Smart Management for Small Water Systems. This project is funded by EPA, and it allows us to provide managerial and financial capacity assistance to small water systems all across the country. In this context, a small water system is defined as one that serves 10,000 people or fewer. We've been providing a series of in-person workshops all across the country on asset management, rates and finance, energy efficiency, water loss, access to funding, and water system collaboration. Hopefully some of you were able to attend one of these in-person trainings. But as part of this project, we're also holding webinars in most of these topic areas to accommodate individuals who weren't able to receive in-person training, or who maybe went to one of our trainings and decided they were interested in a different topic and decided to attend the webinar to get that additional training. Today's webinar is part of the Strategic Water Loss Reduction series of webinars. This first webinar is focused on understanding the problem of water loss. The second webinar will be held on March 17th, and we'll focus that webinar on strategies to address water losses. And the third webinar is going to be on March 31st, and that will focus on how to strategically apply water loss reduction strategies. We will point out how the second and third webinars tie into today's topic as we proceed. We hope you are able to attend all the webinars, but if that isn't possible, each webinar is designed to be standalone. And if you miss a webinar, you can always access the recorded webinar online at the EFC Network website. So again, following this webinar, we'll post the recording of it on our website, and you can access this one and any other webinar that you would like to listen to from any of the other topics. Just as kind of a way of connecting us all together today, since we're all out in watching this electronically, we provided a map that shows where the registrants were located, and you can see we have a pretty good geographic spread across the U.S. mainland and Hawaii and Alaska. So again, welcome to you all, and I hope you find this webinar helpful. So to get started, why do we want to study strategic water loss reduction at all? So one of the main reasons is limited water resources. And if you're in an area that is facing drought or has had drought problems in the past, you understand what it is to have limited water resources, where you don't always have the water available that you would like. You can also have limited water resources if you live in an area where perhaps one source or another is contaminated with something that makes it more difficult to treat, and so you're looking for a different source. So for example, if you have groundwater that's contaminated with arsenic, you may be forced to use surface water to avoid that problem, or perhaps you have to use one well instead of another. So your water resources may be limited, not just because water is more or less available, but perhaps because of what's in the water. And even if you're in a water-rich area, there are certain times of the year or certain years that you might actually face drought situations. So again, limited water resources is a big driver for why we care at all about water loss. Another driver is the need to maximize our system revenues. Part of water loss, as we will discuss later, involves revenues and how to maximize the revenues that the system gets. In this era of limited funding, we want to be sure that we're getting all the money we can to fund our water systems. There's always increasing cost of producing our water, and that includes increased energy cost. Energy is a big part of the cost of production of water, so as the energy cost goes up, our cost of production will go up. And also, as we're getting more and more regulations from EPA, the cost of producing that water can get more and more expensive as you have to add additional treatment methodologies. And then finally, there can be water quality impacts from water loss reduction. If you have pipes that are leaking, it's possible for something to get into your system if you have a reduction in pressure. So there can be some water quality impacts related to water loss. Why we want to look at this strategically is because we want to help you decide the nature of the problem and the best way to spend your limited dollars to address it. So if anybody's listened to one of our asset management webinars, you know that we talk a lot about the fact that with limited dollars, you really have to be strategic about how you spend them. Water loss is no different. We have to be strategic about how we spend those water loss dollars to maximize the impact we can have on our water system. So the first question is, does this equation look familiar? We take water produced, we subtract water sold, and that equals water loss. So the question becomes, what does that water loss number actually represent? So right now we're going to open up a poll question. So Lisa, if you will, open up our poll, our first poll.
Okay, here it comes.
And the first poll question that we have is a question about that water loss value. So what does that water loss value represent? Does it represent the amount of water lost from the system? Does it represent how inaccurate the customer meters are? Does it represent nothing? Is it of absolutely no value to us? Is it non-revenue water, or is it unaccounted for water? What do you believe that that water loss number, again, the equation was water produced minus water sold equals water loss, what does that water loss value represent? So if you'll take a moment to kind of ponder those responses and then choose the one you think best represents the value of that water loss.
Okay, you've got some folks that are still voting, so I'm going to give it another couple of seconds. Okay.
Okay, so we have about 42% say non-revenue water, 48% unaccounted for water, and 10% say it's the amount of water lost from the system. So let's go back to our presentation and let's check into what this value actually represents. In the new scheme of how we look at water loss, the value actually represents non-revenue water. So those of you who picked non-revenue water, that's what we're trying to get across as to what that number actually represents. Some of you, or many of you, picked unaccounted for water. That is older terminology that used to be used. And we used to call it unaccounted for water because we didn't know where it was coming from. What we're trying to change to is non-revenue water because we want to account for that water. We want to know what that water is used for or how it is used. We know we're not going to get revenue from it, or we know we're not getting revenue from it, but we want to actually account for what categories that water falls into. So that's why we're not using the unaccounted for water terminology anymore. So let's look at what that value actually represents in terms of categories. So there are several different categories of water. There's water that's used by the city and town for municipal purposes, you know, watering lawns, parks, providing water for firefighting, that type of thing would go into that category. We have illegal water use, people who are actually stealing water from your system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Water used by the water utility for flushing. You see in the background a picture of a gentleman who is flushing a hydrant. We have lost water. That's the actual water that's leaking from our system. We have inaccurate meters, and we have poor data handling. So those of you who picked water loss was the real water leaking out of the system, you are correct in that that's part of the value, but there are these other activities that also fall into that number. So it's actually, that's why we call it non-revenue water. So why does it actually matter to us what that number represents? Well, if we don't understand the nature of the problem that we actually have, we might apply the wrong solution. We might do the wrong things to fix the problem. If we do that, we can end up wasting money because maybe we're in a different track than we should be. We spend money to buy equipment or for training or for applying a solution, and it may be the wrong solution. We also might waste time. You know, we're spending time on something that we really should be, when we really should be doing something else. We might waste our resources. Our operators, our managers might be off doing the wrong things and we really don't want that to happen. And finally, we might not get the results that we're really after. If we apply the wrong solutions and we don't understand our problem, we may not get the results that we really want to have. So we really need to think much more strategically about water loss. We need to think differently and not just get caught up in doing that one basic equation and then right away rushing to implement a program. We want to think of water loss as really a process. So we want to start with establishing the nature of the problem. You know, what is actually happening in our system? How do we actually account for all that water that is non-revenue water? Then we want to set goals. What is it we really want to achieve with our program? We want to choose appropriate strategies that best address the nature of the problem. We want to prioritize those strategies for implementation. You know, which do we want to do first? How much do we want to do? Really thinking about how do we want to apply the strategies that fit the nature of our problem. And finally, how do we want to pay for that program? Where's the money going to come from to pay for the activities that we want to do? And one of the parts of developing the funding plan is really assessing the potential for increased revenues to be part of that funding stream. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So let's start with establishing the nature of the problem. So the first thing to establish the nature of the problem would be to conduct a water balance or a water audit to determine what's actually occurring in your system. And it looks a little intimidating, I'm sure, to see all those various boxes that you want to put your water usage into. But if you go through it systematically, it's really not so bad. And furthermore, there are really good resources to help you out with this process. One of the best resources is the American Water Works Association Water Audit Tool. This was developed by American Water Works Association's Water Loss Control Committee. They were a committee of practitioners all across the country from different size utilities who really worked for quite a long time to try to figure out how to develop a water audit tool that could be easy to use by water systems, and that would also provide very good information to those systems on what to do about their problems or what the nature of their problem is. This software is available for free on AWWA's website, and all of those participants who joined us here today will receive some instructions on where to go to get the software. You just need to register on their website, and you can download it onto your computer. And there is an instruction sheet. You can see in this screenshot that I have here, you can see that there will be a link when you download the software, and that will give you instructions on how to use the software, which can also help you. Some other helpful things is that they have different colored boxes, and they'll have white boxes where you enter the data yourself. They have orange boxes that are calculated based on the input data that you provide. And finally, they have purple boxes where they recommend default values. So there may be certain times where you just don't know what kind of value to put in the box, and they'll give you some suggestions of what to put there to make it easier for you to complete the water audit process. Additionally, the EFC network has developed a guidebook that is kind of a companion piece for AWWA software. It's to give you information about how best to come up with values to put into the white boxes, and that's available on our website. And again, the attendees of today's webinar will be receiving a link to get that information to help you with your water audit process. The point of the water audit is to help you account for the water in your system. And again, getting back to the reason why we don't call it unaccounted for water anymore is that we want to account for all the water in our system so that we know which boxes that the water falls into. So we no longer want to say that this is unaccounted for. We want to say it's non-revenue. It's water that we're not getting money for, but it is something that we know where it's being used, what it's being used for. So on the first part of the water audit is actually the revenue portion. This is the only portion for which you're receiving revenue, and it includes three main things. If you actually export water to another system or another set of customers, it would be billed water that you export. If you meter your customers, you have your billed metered consumption. And if you don't meter your customers, you have billed unmetered consumption. So these are for the people who have unmetered systems and just charge a flat rate. That use actually falls in the billed unmetered consumption. And then all your metered customers would fit up here. This portion of the water audit is the water that is non-revenue water. So this is everything else. And there's a couple of major categories within this particular part of the water audit. So the first part is authorized use for which we don't bill. So this use can either be unmetered or metered. So we can either have a meter on what we authorize or no meters on that. But in either case, we're not billing for it. The type of use that this would include is watering a public golf course, watering a park, maybe watering the land outside of your municipal buildings, fire flow. It could be the flushing that the water utility is doing. It's all of those things that you're allowing somebody to use the water. You know they're using the water, but you're not sending them a bill for the water that they use. So all of those authorized users fall into this category. The next category is what we term paper losses. This looks like you're losing water, but you're actually not. In this category is unauthorized consumption. So these are people who are using your water and they're not allowed to use your water. This is water theft. The second category is customer meter inaccuracies. So in this category we have if the meters are not reading properly, and that could either be your master meter reading improperly where maybe it hasn't been calibrated for a while. That might not be reading properly, and it can also be your customer meters not reading properly, where they're perhaps reading low, because that's more typical is when a meter fails, it reads less water than is actually passing through. And that will show up looking like a loss when it really is just a loss of revenue. And then finally, we have systematic data handling errors. And in this case, these are the things that we do with the data that maybe are inaccurate. Perhaps somebody has been using the readings on the meter as if they're gallons when maybe they're not in that unit, or maybe they're not putting the numbers in the right places on the spreadsheet or something. Anything that somebody's doing with your data that is incorrect will show up looking like a loss when really it's just improper data handling procedures. And then finally we have our real water losses. This is the part of the balance that people are most focused on usually. And this is the actual water lost from your system. And this is the only portion of the balance that actually represents real water leaking out of your system. There's three main categories here: leakage on your water mains, leakage on your service lines, and then finally leakage and overflows at your storage tanks. So these are the places where we're actually losing real water from our system. So the results of the audit will tell you the nature of the problem you're having. Is it one where you have very high authorized unbilled uses? In this particular case, we're going to be looking at a revenue problem as opposed to a water loss problem. Is it related to our paper losses? Or finally, is it related to the leakage from our system? It could be a combination of these things, but the water audit will help us determine, when we do that water produced minus water sold, what the makeup of that water loss number is. And based on the nature and the size of the problem, that will help us determine what we need to do to address it. So time for a poll question. Has anybody done a water audit on their system? So Lisa, if you will, open our next poll question. So the selections here are yes, and we have used the AWWA methodology. Yes, but we've used a different kind of methodology. No, but we were planning on doing it. No, and we're not planning on doing it. Or finally, it's not applicable to me because I'm not a water system. I wanted to add that selection so that if you were attending today, you can still click on the poll, but you'll have an option that best applies to you.
like we have a few more people still voting. I'm going to wait a couple more seconds. All right, here are the results.
Okay, so we actually have 14% that have used AWWA and 18% that have used something else, so that's great. We have quite a few people that have done a water audit, and then we have 18% that are planning on using it, so that's quite a big percentage of the people on that have either done an audit or are thinking about doing one, so that's very good to see. Okay, if we can go back to the presentation. Okay, so the next part is setting goals. We want to think about what do you want your water loss program to actually achieve. There are different things that you can try to achieve with your water loss program. Are you trying to cut water losses, real water losses, down to just your unavoidable real losses? Are you trying to cut them down just a small percentage from where they are now? Are you trying to achieve a certain water loss per customer? You know, what is it that you're trying to do with your program? Are you trying to maximize revenues? Do you want to focus more on the paper loss side? You know, are you trying to do both things? It's really important to set a goal because that helps you determine how important it is to apply different strategies, and it also helps you prioritize. Anytime you're dealing with a water utility, you're always having to make choices. If I don't spend the money here, I can spend it there. If I spend it here, I can't spend it there. You always have to make a choice about where to apply your funds. So the goal setting exercise will help you make better decisions about where to apply your funds. And if anybody's seen our asset management workshops, we like to use this acronym in setting goals. It's called SMART. And it means that we want to have specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals. So for example, if setting a goal that you want to reduce water loss, and that's all you say, is not very specific. We don't really know what that means. We would much rather have something like, we will reduce real water losses by 10% based on 2014's water audit value within the next 2 years. That's a very specific goal. We all know exactly what we're talking about. And then it's also measurable. I can measure that by doing another water audit in 2 years and determine if I've made an impact. We want to make sure that all of our goals are measurable and that there is a way to measure them. We want to make sure our goals are attainable. If, for example, I said something like, I will reduce water losses to, real water losses to 0% within my system, that goal is not attainable. There is nothing we can do about getting down to 0 because there's always going to be a little bit of unavoidable losses, a little bit of background water loss, and it's really not attainable to get to 0. And plus, even if it was, it would be extraordinarily expensive to get there. So we wouldn't want to set that as our goal. We want our goals to be relevant. If your biggest issue is paper losses, you know, related to your meters, you don't want to set a goal that relates to unbilled authorized consumption. You want to make sure that your goals are relevant to what it is you're trying to achieve and the problems that you have in your system. And then finally, some goals require or are better if there's a time-bound element, so that you can think about over what period are you trying to achieve that. So I mentioned in the first goal that it would be over 2 years. So we're putting a time-bound element so we know how fast we want to get there. If we don't have that element, it is a lot harder to apply our techniques because we don't know how fast we need to get that done. So we want to kind of think about, you know, as we set goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound as kind of the criteria by which we set those goals. And we don't have to get crazy and set, you know, hundreds of goals. We're just talking about, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 goals that are very specific for your water loss program that really help you kind of focus in on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So we have another poll question here. Have you set goals related to your water losses? So Lisa, if you will open our third question. So this question is, has your system set any goals related to water loss? So your choices here are yes, we have goals and we measure how well we meet them. Yes, but we don't measure whether we meet them or not. No, but we were working on it. No. not applicable, meaning that you're not a water system. So the second choice there is if you have goals but you don't really go back and look at them to see whether or not you've actually met the goal, you would pick the second choice. So take a minute to kind of look over the choices and see which one you think best applies to your system. Okay, so we have 19% that have goals and measure them, and 2% that don't measure, and then 25% are working on them, 15% don't have them, and then everybody else was not applicable. So at least we have some activity going on in the goal setting, which is really good, because I would encourage everybody who goes down the path of water loss reduction to really think about having good goals for your program so that it can help focus you in on what it is you need to do and how to do it. So we can go back to the presentation now. All right, so the next part is choosing appropriate strategies. We want to make sure that the strategies that we're looking at applying in our system best fit what's actually wrong with the system. We don't want to, again, apply the wrong strategies and then find out that it's not going to achieve the results we want. So if you think about it, you know, going back to the beginning when we talked about the equation of water produced minus water sold equals water loss, if we dig no further into that number, we might just jump into doing something. We might just say, okay, based on that number, I'm going to go do a water loss detection program. I'm going to look for water loss. I'm going to spend, you know, thousands of dollars seeking water losses, and I'm going to fix the broken pipe. It's kind of skipping several steps if we go that route. And somebody I listened to once had a nice analogy that said if you go to the doctor because you have chest pain, the first thing they do is not rush you to surgery and cut your chest open. They're going to ask you other questions. They're going to do other tests. They're going to find out what's actually wrong with you first, and only if you need surgery will you go down that route. Well, water loss is sort of the same way. We want to really be sure what our problem is, and we want to think about what is the right solution, because if you're having chest pain just because you have heartburn, surgery is not the right solution. So if we're having an issue that's more related to authorized consumption, for example, then we don't want to be doing a water loss detection program if we're trying to reach a different issue. So when we get to our strategies related to authorized unbilled consumption, again, what we're talking about here is the type of water use that's something like firefighting, flushing the system, watering public parks or public golf courses, street cleaning, water that you might provide for other municipal facilities, watering of lawns around municipal buildings. That type of activity is what we're talking about with unauthorized unbilled consumption. So we have two issues here. The first is, can that water use be cut down? And the second is, can any of it be billed for? So if we look at the first question, are we watering our parks excessively? Are we watering them every day when maybe they only need to be watered every other day? Are we using too much water, you know, more than the grass actually needs? So are we wasting any water? And it doesn't matter if you're in a water-rich or a water-poor area. It's always a good idea to look at this type of use and say, do we really need to be using as much water? Because this is actual drinking water that you took the time to produce and clean, and so you want to make sure it's used wisely. You might want to look at new technologies. Can you get a technology that doesn't allow for watering if it's rained? There are some technologies that are starting to look at soil moisture, and they're adjusting the watering to match how much water the soil actually needs. So can you apply new technologies? Can you look at alternatives? So if you have land out in front of a public building and you're currently watering it so that grass can grow, is there a way to switch to xeriscaping or lower water using plants that maybe don't need to be watered as much? So again, on the first part, you want to think about how can you cut down the water use, and you know, even for something like flushing, have you done studies to actually determine whether your flushing program is, you know, flushing too much or not enough? you might be flushing some areas too often and some areas not often enough. So you might be able to adjust how much you use for flushing as well. On the flip side, you're not billing for this water. You might want to look at, could you bill for this water? Is there a way to get somebody to pay for the use? For example, if it's a public golf course, do people pay greens fees to go play there? And is there a way that you can get part of those green fees that would go towards offsetting the water use? Or is the park being used almost exclusively by a baseball league or a soccer club, and could they pay part of the water cost? There are some people that actually have a transfer of funds when firefighting water is used. You know, is that something you could do? Could you have municipal uses pay for some of those waters? You're not ever going to get to the point where you bill for all of this type of consumption, but is there a way to maybe recoup some revenue for some of the water that's used? The second one, strategies related to paper losses, we have 3 different issues here. The first we talked about was water theft. The 2 main ways that people steal water would be through hydrants, maybe illegally connecting onto a hydrant and taking water. That might be, you know, a construction company or road maintenance crews that are illegally getting your water because they don't want to be paying for it or they don't want it metered. So somebody who's connecting up to a hydrant and taking your water. And the second way is a customer who has tapped into your system, maybe by connecting into a neighbor's pipe before the meter, or maybe they've just tied directly into your system. Or perhaps you've locked out their meter and they've figured out, you know, how to cut off the lock or to bypass the lock so that they can actually get water, bypass the meter. So it's people who are doing something that is illegally using the water and they're not paying revenue for it. The first thing you'd have to do is figure out how bad that problem really is, you know, how rampant it is within your system. And if it's customers who are stealing the water, you might need to have systematic programs where you go out and check, you know, is every meter connected up to a house? You know, we have 30 houses in the community and there's only 25 meters. What are the other houses doing? You know, something like that where you're actually systematically going and checking. You want to make sure you have very stringent policies and penalties for people who do this kind of thing so that if you do catch somebody, that it's a very negative repercussion for what they're doing. If it's people stealing water out of your hydrants, again, you want policies related to that and penalties. And you might want to consider, if it's a huge problem, you might want to consider having a couple of hydrants that are designated for construction companies and others to use, and paint those a different color and alert your public, you know, your customers and the police that if anybody else connects up to a hydrant, maybe your hydrants that are for construction purposes are green and every other hydrant is red. So you could have them on the lookout for if anybody connects up to a red hydrant, you know, they're not supposed to do that, please call us and alert us, and you can maybe catch people that way. If it's customer meters that are causing the problem and you have maybe a lot of stopped meters, you know, meters that are no longer functional, or you have meters that are reading low, which is typical. When meters fail to work, they typically read low. You might want to have somebody come in and assess the quality of your meters. They could do a calibration and determine how bad your meters are. They could do a random sampling. You could then figure out, are there certain meters in certain areas that are the biggest problem? Is it certain age meter, certain type of meter? And then you can design a meter replacement program around that information. So if you really need to get some new meters, you can choose where the most important places to put those meters are, and then you can increase your revenues. And then finally, if you have data handling issues, you want to look at how the data is being handled, who is handling it, do they have proper training, do they understand the situation, and you can start to deal with the data handling errors that you're having and hopefully improve your data quality and resolve that. That's probably one of the easiest ones to resolve if you're having an issue in that regard. Strategies to address real losses. There are 4 main strategies that are used to address real losses, and one is to respond faster to leaks that you know about. Another is asset management principles, where we're trying to strategically replace pipe that's causing us problem. A third one is to reduce pressure. And the fourth one is to find hidden leaks within our system. So we can use these particular approaches to really address our water losses, and we're going to focus heavily on those strategies in webinar 2. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about the strategies, because again, that will be the focus of the next webinar, really digging into how each of these techniques can apply to your system, how they work, what they mean, and why you might want to apply them. So please tune in for webinar 2, and we'll get into those issues a lot more. The fourth activity we want to do is to prioritize strategies for implementation. We have to think about, what we're trying to accomplish and how we want to accomplish it in order to properly prioritize what we want to do. So some of the things we want to think about are, what is the size of the problem we're trying to address? How bad is it? So how bad is the real water loss that we're facing? How bad is the unbilled authorized consumption portion of our system? What is the cost of addressing those particular issues? How much would it cost us to replace meters? How much would it cost us to do a leak detection survey? How much would it cost us to be able to respond to leaks faster? What are the resources that we would need to address the problem? Do we need equipment? Do we need additional personnel? Do we need to train our personnel? What are we going to have to address a particular problem that we're having? We want to think about the criticality of the assets. So, for example, on the real water loss side, if perhaps we're leaking out of a storage tank, maybe that's the only storage tank in town, so it's a very critical asset. That's going to help us decide to prioritize that a little bit higher, because that asset is so important to our system. Or perhaps we're having a lot of leaks on very critical pipe within our system, and again, that will help us decide what we want to do. We want to look at the potential for that particular solution to generate revenue. So if we're going to do something that might result in more revenue from customers or more revenue related to our authorized uses that are currently unbilled, how much that might play into our decisions. And then finally, how well does it address the goals? We talked about setting goals in step 2. We want to make sure that whatever we decide to implement is actually going to address those goals. We're really going to focus webinar 3 on the process of how you decide to strategically apply your approaches and to prioritize what you want to do. So that's going to be heavily dealt with in webinar 3. So please come back for that one to hear a little bit more about prioritizing. And then finally, the last step in the process is really developing a funding plan. So when we think about funding, the type of things we want to think about is, will water savings offset the cost? And this is one that's a little bit tricky. It's something that comes up a lot. Can't you just use the water that you save to offset the cost of your program? And generally speaking, this isn't a very good trade-off, because the water savings is generally very small. It doesn't actually cost us that much to produce water. So the cost of the program can still greatly outweigh the water savings. So this is part of the issue, but in general it won't cover the whole cost of your program unless it's very expensive for you to produce water. If you're desalinating or you have extremely expensive energy, it might be a closer match, but if you have very cheap water to produce, it generally will not offset all the costs of looking for the leaks or addressing other things within your system. You can also look at, will revenue be generated to pay for all or part of what you want to do? So are you going to change out meters that might generate more customer revenue? Are you going to start billing for authorized uses that you currently didn't bill for? And will they allow you to put any of that revenue to pay for all or part of your program? Will you achieve any savings from reduced catastrophic events? And what I'm talking about with catastrophic event is, say, a sinkhole that develops because you haven't looked for a leak that's been going on for a long time. A sinkhole develops and now we have a huge cost. Or a major geyser of water develops and that causes us a lot of expenses. If we prevent that kind of thing, which a real water loss program can help prevent, can we use savings from reduced number of catastrophic events to pay for our program? Can we use the program to save money on pipe replacement? So maybe somebody says, well, we want to replace 20 miles of pipe within the system, and you say, well, you don't really need to replace all 20 miles because if I go through and leak detect, I can find out maybe where part of the problem areas are, and we can cut down the pipe replacement to some smaller amount based on just strategically fixing pipe. And if so, can some of that money be used to pay for your program? Is there a budget for water loss reduction in your system at all? I mean, when you have a line item for, do you have a line item for water loss reduction? Is that money that you could be using for your program? And lastly, is there public support for a program of this type? And if so, can you have maybe supplemental payment on your bill or something that would allow you to put money specifically towards a water loss program? You may have public support if you're in a very drought-prone area and you're having a lot of water loss issues that are related to real losses. The public may be very willing to pay for a program to look for those losses and cut those down because they want to make sure that their resources there for the future. Or if there's a really high authorized unbilled use or really high water theft, both of those might gain public support because maybe they say, well, it'd be more fair if the customers who are stealing water are paying, or if some of, specific customers who are being given water start to pay for it. So there may be some public support for different kinds of programs, and maybe that can generate you some revenue. In these webinars, we always like to have a section at the end that talks about, what you can do at your own facility following the webinar. And one of the first things that you can do, and it applies in a lot of different settings, is develop a team of people that can help you get this accomplished. And in the water loss arena, you're probably looking at operators, you're looking at billing people, you're looking for managers, people who are fixing pipe within your system, whoever kind of has a role in the water loss issues that you're having. Those are the people that you would want on your team to help you kind of look into the water loss problems that you're having. The second thing is to complete the AWWA water audit, or if you have another audit process that you like, that's fine as well. And again, we will send you information on how to access this particular software and our guidebook to help you through that process of kind of really thinking about what's going on in your system. Set some goals for what you would like to achieve. Try setting, a couple of goals. What is it you want to actually accomplish when you do your water loss program? What do you want to achieve? You sit down and kind of write a few goals and see if that can focus you on what you want to do next. Tune into webinars 2 and 3 to learn more about options for addressing real losses. Again, we will focus much more heavily on webinars 2 and 3 in the actual real water loss portion of the balance and how you can look for those, how you can strategically apply the different options that you have to make sure you get the biggest bang for the buck that you're going to spend. We also have assistance in addition to water loss. I mentioned those other areas that we've been working on in this project. So we wanted to take an opportunity to allow you to answer a poll question on the types of assistance that you might be interested in that's separate and apart from water loss. So I did not put water loss up here because we will contact you again with regard to water loss. But if you have interest in assistance in some of the other areas, asset management, rates and finance, water system collaboration, multiple funding, or energy efficiency, please go ahead and click whichever one you would like assistance in and submit that result, and we will follow up with you after the webinar. So take a moment and think about it, and if there are issues that you're having, please go ahead and select one of the options there.
I'm going to give it another 5 seconds or so. Okay.
Okay, great. We got a nice mix of folks who might want some assistance. And if we can go back to the webinar, That kind of leads us to the follow-up that will occur after this webinar. Again, we will contact attendees with answers to any questions that came in during the webinar, access to resources for the water loss, and a chance to ask for assistance with water loss. And then if you just filled out that poll question of other types of assistance, we will get back in touch with you to kind of follow up on what type of assistance you would like. I wanted to just bring your attention to some upcoming webinars that you might be interested in. Tomorrow we're going to do a rebroadcast of the first asset management webinar. We did not record that particular webinar, and we want to go back and rebroadcast and record that so it will be available online. The other 4 asset management webinars are already up there. So if you're interested in asset management, kind of the beginning stages, please tune in tomorrow for that webinar. We have leadership, part 2, effective messaging, that will occur on the 7th. On the 12th, we have a water system partnerships and regionalization webinar. That's the water company model. And then I already mentioned that on the 17th and 31st, we'll have the 2nd and 3rd parts of the water loss reduction webinar series. If you would like to register for any of these webinars, please visit efcnetwork.org/upcoming. Or if you can't remember the upcoming parts, you can always just go to efcnetwork.org and look for trainings, and you'll be able to get to the registration link that way. So please join us for any of these webinars that look of interest to you. We would like to thank EPA for providing funding for this project, and we appreciate the ability to come to you with in-person and webinar type trainings through this project. And finally, I have our contact information up here, and while we're going through the final pieces here, we'll have a few minutes for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the box, the chat box, so that we can see what your questions are and answer the ones that we're able to answer. And if we don't get through them all, or we need additional time to answer, we will send the answers in writing to everybody. But on that page, you'll see, on the page that's up now, you see my contact information as well as Dawn Null's contact information. And again, if you have questions after this webinar, please feel free to contact us. And please remember that we will have this recorded webinar up on our website soon, and you can always access it if you would like to go back to anything we talked about today. You're welcome to do so. And with that, I will turn it over to Dawn to see if we have any questions that have come in during the webinar.
We do have one question right now, and it's, will these trainings have CEUs that can be gained from attending them? And the answer to that is because we have people from all 50 states attending the webinars, we do not apply for CEUs in each state. Each state has different rules and regulations, but most states will allow the individuals to provide proof of attending a webinar, and you can submit that to your state to request approval for CEUs or credits for being a certified operator or a board member, things of that nature. And upon the conclusion of this webinar, you will get an email from us that has the link to our survey that you can use as proof of attendance. And if you need more than that, then you can email me and I can provide you with additional proof of attendance if your state requires that.
And our in-person workshops were including CEUs, so if you're ever able to attend an in-person workshop in the future, you will receive CEUs for those. We did receive funding for a second round of managerial and financial assistance, so within the next 18 months we'll be back out providing some more in-person training. So if you have the ability to attend any of our in-person trainings, those do generally include CEUs, and we apply for the CEUs for the states. Sometimes we have multiple states that send attendees, and we'll apply for the CEUs for all the states around where our trainings are held.
And I don't have any other questions that have come in. I wanted to remind everyone that in the chat box is the link for our evaluation for our survey, and you will also receive that in an email. So please, if you would take the time to give us your feedback, we'd certainly appreciate that.
And again, I hope you're able to join us for webinars 2 and 3, where we will be digging in very deep into the ways to address real water losses. So this is the actual water that's leaking from the pipes, and we'll talk about, ways to address that, what kind of techniques are available. And then the final webinar would be looking at how can you strategically apply those techniques so that you can receive the biggest advantage, the biggest result for the amount of money that you spend. And there are some techniques that you can use to really make a better, to make a bigger difference in how you apply those techniques. So please, if you can, join us for those webinars. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar.